The silence in the briefing room stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of jets taxiing on the tarmac. Colonel Marcus Vega stood before a room of 23 pilots, his weathered face etched with the kind of gravity that comes from sending young men and women into harm's way for 3 decades. The mission brief glowed on the screen behind him, a red target marker deep in hostile territory, surrounded by concentric circles of SAM sites like a deadly spider's web. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of command, "what you're looking at is grid reference November 7 Alpha. Intelligence confirms a high-value target is holed up in this compound, approximately 40 clicks behind enemy lines. The problem isn't getting there, it's getting out alive." The briefing room erupted in low murmurs as pilots studied the tactical display. Surface-to-air missile batteries formed overlapping kill zones. Mobile anti-aircraft guns created corridors of death. Electronic warfare jammers promised to blind navigation systems. It was a fortress of steel and fire, designed to turn aircraft into falling debris. "The target window is 18 minutes, Vega continued, clicking to the next slide. "That's how long we estimate before they move the package to a hardened bunker. Once that happens, we lose our chance for 6 months, maybe forever." Captain Razor Morrison, the squadron's golden boy with his perfectly pressed flight suit and cocky grin, leaned back in his chair. "Sir, what about cruise missiles? Precision strike?" "Negative, collateral damage concerns. This has to be surgical, a pilot's touch." The room fell silent again. Every aviator in that room had flown combat missions. They dodged bullets and missiles, felt the terror of being hunted by enemy fighters. But this was different. This was a suicide run dressed up as a mission brief. Lieutenant Colonel James "Brick" Harrison, the squadron's most experienced pilot, slowly shook his head. "Colonel, with respect, that's not a mission. That's a death sentence with wings." Nods of agreement rippled through the room. These weren't cowards speaking. These were warriors who understood the difference between acceptable risk and certain death. The math was simple. Fly into that kill zone and you don't fly out. Vega's jaw tightened. He'd known this would be their reaction, but he'd hoped, prayed, that someone would step forward. The mission was critical. Lives hung in the balance. But he couldn't order a pilot to fly what amounted to a kamikaze run. In the back corner of the briefing room, Captain Delilah Ghost Thorne sat motionless, her pale blue eyes fixed on the tactical display. While others whispered and shifted in their seats, she remained perfectly still, studying the maze of death on the screen with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a final move. Nobody noticed when she stood. The scrape of her chair against the linoleum floor was soft, almost apologetic. But as she moved toward the front of the room, conversations died one by one. 22 pairs of eyes tracked her movement, and something in her posture, the set of her shoulders, the deliberate pace of her steps, made the air itself seem to thicken with anticipation. Vega turned, his expression shifting from resignation to surprise as Ghost approached the podium. She said nothing. Instead, she reached for the mission roster clipboard, her movements precise and economical. The pen clicked softly as she signed her name on the volunteer line. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, every person in the room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just an act of courage, but a declaration of intent that would echo through the halls of military legend. Ghost turned to face her fellow pilots, her expression calm as still water. "Someone has to fly it," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of inevitability. "Might as well be me." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Razor shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Are you out of your goddamn mind, Thorne? That's not heroism, that's stupidity." Other voices joined the chorus. "She's lost it. Command will never approve this. Ghost, sit down before you do something you'll regret if you live long enough to regret it." But Colonel Vega raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Ghost's face. In 30 years of command, he'd learned to recognize something in a pilot's eyes, that moment when training, instinct, and pure will crystallized into unshakable resolve. He saw it now, burning quietly in Ghost's pale blue gaze. "Captain Thorne," he said carefully, "this isn't a request for volunteers. This is a briefing to assess feasibility." "With respect, sir," Ghost replied, "feasibility just walked up to your podium and signed its name." The room erupted in arguments and protests, but Ghost remained at the front, unmoved by the storm she'd created. She studied the tactical display again, her mind already working through approach vectors and timing calculations. The others saw an impossible mission. She saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. Captain Diesel Kowalski, a grizzled veteran with more combat hours than most pilots accumulated in a lifetime, stood slowly. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Ghost, I've seen good pilots die on easy missions. This isn't brave, it's insane." Ghost turned to meet his gaze, and for a moment the two pilots regarded each other across a chasm of understanding. Diesel had flown with her for 2 years. He knew her reputation, her skills, her uncanny ability to navigate situations that left other pilots as smoking craters in foreign soil. "Diesel," she said, her voice soft but clear, "remember Kandahar, when they said no one could get through the mountain pass during that sandstorm?" His face darkened. He remembered. A downed helicopter crew, Taliban closing in, zero visibility, and a deadline measured in minutes rather than hours. Every pilot in the squadron had deemed it impossible. Every pilot except Ghost, who'd taken her A-10 through the pass in conditions that would have grounded commercial aircraft. "That was different," Diesel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Different how?" Ghost asked. "Because the enemy couldn't see me, or because you couldn't see how I'd make it out?" The question hung in the air like cordite after a firing range session. Every pilot in the room had heard the stories about Ghost, how she'd earned her call sign by appearing in impossible places at impossible times, delivering death to enemies who never saw her coming and salvation to friendlies who'd given up hope. Lieutenant Viper Hayes, the youngest pilot in the squadron, spoke up from near the back. "But Ghost, this isn't about flying through weather. Those SAM sites, they'll light you up the moment you cross the border." Ghost nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words. "They'll try," she said. "Question is, can they track something they can't predict?" She moved to the tactical display, her finger tracing potential routes through the missile network. The others watched, some shaking their heads in dismay, others leaning forward despite themselves, drawn by the quiet confidence in her voice. "Standard approach would be low and fast," she continued, "hugging terrain, avoiding radar coverage. But that's what they expect. That's what their defenses are designed to counter." Her finger moved to a different section of the map, highlighting what appeared to be the most heavily defended approach vector. "Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight." The room erupted again, but this time the protests carried a different undertone. Where before there had been simple disbelief, now there was something else: curiosity, perhaps even grudging respect. These were pilots who understood that the line between genius and madness was often invisible until after the mission was complete. Colonel Vega stepped closer to the display, his command authority reasserting itself over the chaos. "Captain Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official inquiry, "are you formally volunteering for this mission?" Ghost turned to face him, her expression as calm as a lake before dawn. "Sir, I'm not just volunteering, I'm telling you it can be done." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Every person in that room understood the difference between a desperate gesture and a calculated assessment. Ghost wasn't throwing her life away on a hopeless cause. She was stating, with quiet certainty, that she had found a way through the maze. "Then convince me," Vega said simply. What followed was 20 minutes of the most intense tactical discussion any of them had ever witnessed. Ghost walked them through her analysis, breaking down enemy response patterns, radar coverage gaps, and timing windows with the precision of a surgeon and the insight of a prophet. She identified weaknesses in the defensive network that others had missed, explained how terrain masking could be used in ways the textbooks never taught, and outlined an approach that transformed certain death into merely probable death. By the time she finished, the room had fallen into a different kind of silence. This wasn't the stunned quiet of disbelief, but the thoughtful pause of professionals recognizing expertise they hadn't expected to encounter. Razor, who had been the most vocal opponent, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Okay," he admitted grudgingly, "maybe it's not completely insane, but Ghost, why you? Why not send a flight of F-16s? Speed and numbers." Ghost's smile was barely perceptible, but those who knew her caught the hint of something that might have been amusement. "Because F-16s are racehorses," she said. "Fast, elegant, built for speed and agility. This mission doesn't need a racehorse." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, meeting each pilot's eyes in turn. "It needs a bulldozer with wings." The reference to her aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, drew nods of understanding from the more experienced pilots. While other aircraft were built for speed and maneuverability, the A-10 was constructed around a single principle: survival. It could absorb damage that would down other planes, fly on one engine, navigate with half its control surfaces destroyed, and still deliver its payload with surgical precision. "The Hog can take punishment," Ghost continued, "but more importantly, it can dish it out. Those SAM sights, they're hardened against precision munitions, but they're not designed to withstand 30-millimeter depleted uranium rounds fired from a plane that refuses to die." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had initially called the mission a death sentence, leaned forward in his chair. "Ghost, even assuming you make it through the defenses, even assuming you neutralize the target, how do you plan to get out? The moment you light up that first SAM site, every piece of hardware in a 50-mile radius will be vectoring on your position." "Brick," Ghost replied, using his call sign with the familiarity born of shared danger. "You're thinking like a fighter pilot. Hit fast, hit hard, get out clean. The A-10 wasn't built to run away from fights." She moved to the map again, her finger tracing what looked like a random path through the hostile territory. "The key isn't avoiding the enemy's attention, it's controlling it. Make them react to me instead of responding to their training." What she outlined next was part psychology, part physics, and entirely dependent on split-second timing and nerves of steel. She would use the enemy's own defensive network against them, turning their strength into weakness through a combination of misdirection, calculated aggression, and what she called controlled chaos. By the time Ghost finished her explanation, the mood in the room had shifted completely. The initial shock had given way to professional assessment, which had evolved into grudging admiration, and finally settled into something approaching awe. Captain Morrison, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine curiosity, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Ghost, where did you learn to think like this? This isn't standard tactics, this is something else entirely." For the first time since she'd stood up, Ghost's composed expression flickered. Something moved behind her eyes, a shadow of memory, perhaps, or the weight of experiences she'd never shared with her squadron mates. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, something deeper and more personal than the clinical precision of her tactical briefing. "You learn to think outside the box," she said quietly, "when the box keeps trying to kill you." Colonel Vega had been studying Ghost throughout her presentation, and now he stepped forward with the air of a commander who had reached a decision. "Captain Thorne, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain you can complete this mission and return to base?" Ghost met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, I can't promise I'll come back without holes in my aircraft. I can't guarantee I won't need medical attention when I land. But I can promise you this. The target will be neutralized and I will return to base under my own power. The certainty in her voice was absolute, carrying the weight of someone who had made similar promises before and kept them. Around the room, pilots who had initially dismissed her as suicidal were beginning to see something different, not recklessness, but a form of calculated courage they hadn't encountered before. Vega nodded slowly. "Very well, Captain, mission approved. You'll launch at 5:30 hours. Godspeed." The briefing room emptied quickly after that, pilots dispersing to their various duties and preparations. But as Ghost gathered her materials, she noticed that several of her squadron mates lingered, their expressions thoughtful and somehow different than they had been an hour earlier. Diesel approached her as she headed for the door. "Ghost," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, if anyone can pull this off, it's you. But promise me something, promise me you'll come back. The squadron, we need pilots like you." Ghost paused at the threshold, considering his words. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the fragile nature of promises made in war. "Diesel," she said, "I'll do my best. That's all any of us can do." The morning air was crisp and clean as Ghost walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat in its hardstand like a patient predator, its gray paint scheme making it nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. Ground crew members moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, conducting final checks and loading ordnance with the precision that comes from years of repetition. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, Ghost's dedicated crew chief, looked up as her pilot approached. Santos had been maintaining A-10s for 8 years, but she'd never worked with a pilot quite like Ghost. Where other aviators treated their aircraft as sophisticated machines, Ghost seemed to regard her Warthog as a living thing, capable of moods and preferences that transcended mechanical explanation. "She's ready, ma'am," Santos reported, pride evident in her voice. "Full fuel, full ordnance load, all systems green. I've given her extra attention to the hydraulics and flight controls, figured you might need the redundancy where you're going." Ghost nodded her appreciation. "What's your assessment, Santos? Honest opinion." The sergeant considered the question carefully. In the military hierarchy, crew chiefs occupied a unique position, technically subordinate to pilots, but possessed of knowledge and experience that could mean the difference between a successful mission and a smoking crater. Santos had seen Ghost return from missions that should have been impossible, her aircraft bearing damage that should have been fatal. "Ma'am," Santos said finally, "I've seen this bird take hits that would drop anything else in the Air Force inventory. She's tough, reliable, and she's got something extra that I can't put in a technical manual. But this mission," she paused, searching for the right words, "this is different. The intelligence reports, the threat assessment, it's like they're asking you to fly through hell itself." Ghost ran her hand along the A-10's armored nose, feeling the slight roughness where previous missions had left their marks. "Santos, what do you know about the aircraft designation? Why they call it the Thunderbolt?" "After the P-47 from World War II, ma'am. Republic Aviation's legacy design." "Deeper than that," Ghost said, her voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a hard-earned truth. "The P-47 had a reputation in the war. Pilots called it the Jug because it looked like a milk jug, ugly, ungainly, not particularly fast or maneuverable. But it had one characteristic that made it legendary. It could absorb incredible amounts of damage and keep flying. Pilots would come back with engines shot full of holes, control surfaces missing, hydraulics failed, and the plane would still get them home." Santos nodded, understanding the connection. The A-10 had inherited more than just a name from its predecessor. It had inherited a philosophy of survival through sheer, stubborn durability. "The mission planners see the threat assessment and think, impossible," Ghost continued. They see the SAM sights and the anti-aircraft guns and they calculate probability of survival at near zero. But they're thinking about this wrong. They're thinking about avoiding damage instead of surviving it. She completed her walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces, weapon mounts, and engine intakes with the thoroughness of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Santos watched her work, noting the quiet confidence in Ghost's movements, the way she seemed to commune with the aircraft rather than simply inspecting it. "Ma'am," Santos said as Ghost prepared to climb into the cockpit, "can I ask you something? The other pilots, they seem to think you're taking an unnecessary risk, but you don't act like someone who's scared. Why?" Ghost paused with one foot on the boarding ladder, considering the question. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won experience and something that might have been sadness. "Santos, fear is a luxury for people who have choices. Sometimes the mission chooses you, not the other way around. When that happens, the only question left is whether you're going to do it right or do it wrong." She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the practiced ease of someone who had made the same movements hundreds of times before. The familiar smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and worn leather enveloped her as she began the startup sequence. Around her, switches and indicators came to life in a carefully choreographed dance of preparation. The radio crackled to life as she ran through her pre-flight checks. "Ghost Rider Tower, you are cleared for engine start." "Tower Ghost Rider, starting engines." The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans wound up with a rising whine that settled into a steady rumble. Ghost felt the subtle vibrations through her seat as the aircraft systems came online, each subsystem reporting its readiness for the mission ahead. The heads-up display flickered to life, overlaying critical flight information on the bulletproof glass of the cockpit canopy. As she completed her checks, Ghost's radio came alive with an unexpected transmission. "Ghost Rider, Razor 11, flight of 4 F-16s requesting permission to provide escort." Ghost keyed her microphone, surprised by the offer. "Razor, this is Ghost Rider. Negative on escort. Mission parameters require single aircraft penetration." "Ghost Rider, Razor. Understood, but we'll be maintaining high CAP at the border. If you need help getting out, we'll be there." The gesture touched something in Ghost that she kept carefully buried during working hours. Throughout her career, she'd grown accustomed to being seen as the squadron oddball, the quiet pilot who flew alone and preferred it that way. But now, facing what everyone acknowledged was a near-suicide mission, her fellow aviators were offering what support they could. "Razor Ghost Rider, appreciated. I'll call if I need a ride home." She taxied toward the runway, the A-10's nose wheel steering responding smoothly to her inputs. The aircraft felt solid beneath her, 30 tons of hardened steel and titanium ready to carry her into the valley of the shadow of death. As she reached the runway threshold, Tower cleared her for takeoff. "Ghost Rider Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Good hunting." Ghost pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the TF-34 engines spooled up to takeoff power. The A-10 gathered speed down the runway, its landing gear drumming against the concrete until the moment of liftoff, that magical instant when gravity released its hold and the aircraft became a creature of the sky. As she climbed into the pre-dawn darkness, Ghost felt a familiar sense of peace settle over her. Up here, above the complexities of human politics and military bureaucracy, there was only the mission and the skills needed to complete it. The aircraft responded to her inputs with the precision of a finely tuned instrument, and for a moment, pilot and machine achieved that rare synthesis that transforms good aviators into legendary ones. Behind her, the lights of the airbase fell away into the darkness. Ahead lay hostile territory, deadly defenses, and a target that had to be neutralized regardless of the cost. But for now, There was only the steady rumble of the engines, the gentle vibration of the controls, and the infinite canvas of stars overhead. As she reached cruising altitude and turned toward the target area, Ghost began the mental transformation that every combat pilot knew, the shift from person to weapon system, from individual to instrument of national will. By the time she crossed into hostile airspace, Captain Delilah Thorne would be gone, replaced by something harder and more focused, a precision weapon with a human heart. The first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon as Ghost approached the border, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Her radar warning receiver remained quiet, indicating that enemy search radars hadn't yet detected her presence. The low-altitude approach was working exactly as planned, the A-10's small radar cross-section and careful route selection keeping her invisible to hostile sensors. 20 minutes out from the target, Ghost's radio crackled with an encrypted transmission from the AWACS aircraft providing overwatch for the mission. Ghost Rider, Magic Eye, we show multiple SAM sites activating search radars in your target area. Recommend you abort and return to base. Ghost checked her navigation display, confirming her position and the location of the hostile radar emissions. The enemy was waking up, their defensive networks beginning to probe the sky for potential threats. In a few minutes, her presence would be detected and the gauntlet would begin in earnest. Magic Eye Ghost Rider, negative on abort, proceeding to target. Ghost Rider Magic Eye, be advised, we're tracking at least 6 SA-15 mobile SAM launchers converging on your route. This is looking like a trap. Ghost's jaw tightened as she processed the intelligence update. SA-15 Gauntlet surface-to-air missiles were designed specifically to engage low-flying aircraft like hers. Mobile and deadly, they could establish overlapping kill zones that would be nearly impossible to penetrate. But nearly impossible wasn't the same as completely impossible. Magic Eye understood, Ghost Rider proceeding. What followed was a 15-minute chess match played at 300 knots and 50 feet above hostile terrain. Ghost used every trick she'd learned in 8 years of combat flying, terrain masking to break radar locks, chaff and flare to confuse incoming missiles, and sudden course changes that kept enemy gunners guessing about her intended target. The first SAM launch came without warning, a telephone pole of death rising from a concealed launcher site directly in her flight path. Ghost jinked hard left, pulling enough GS to gray out her vision, and felt the missile's proximity fuse detonate somewhere behind her aircraft. Shrapnel peppered the A-10's armored skin like deadly hail, but the Warthog shrugged off the damage and continued flying. Ghost Rider Magic Eye, SAM launch your 6 o'clock high. Ghost was already reacting to the second missile before the radio call finished, diving toward a ridgeline that would break the enemy's radar lock. The SA-15 corkscrewed past her position, its guidance system confused by the sudden altitude change and the chaff blossoming in the aircraft's wake. As she crested the ridge, Ghost found herself looking down into the valley that held her target. The intelligence photos hadn't done justice to the defensive positions surrounding the compound. It was a fortress of interconnected bunkers, weapon emplacements, and camouflaged vehicles that represented years of careful preparation. But intelligence had also missed something crucial, a weakness in the defensive network that became apparent only from this specific angle and altitude. Ghost's tactical mind cataloged the opportunity even as her hands flew over the aircraft's weapon controls, preparing for the attack run that would define her career, assuming she survived the next 3 minutes. The compound's main defensive radar locked onto her aircraft, and Ghost felt the familiar chill that came with being hunted by sophisticated weapon systems. The radar warning receiver filled the cockpit with urgent beeping as multiple SAM sites acquired her aircraft and began their firing sequences. This was the moment she'd prepared for, the point where training, instinct, and pure will would determine whether she became a legend or a cautionary tale. Ghost pushed the A-10 into a shallow dive, building speed for the attack run while simultaneously calculating intercept angles, weapon release parameters, and escape routes. The target compound grew larger in her heads-up display, its defensive positions now clearly visible despite their camouflage. Ghost armed her weapons systems, feeling the subtle change in the aircraft's handling as 30mm rounds fed into the GAU-8 Avenger cannon's firing chamber. She had one chance to get this right, one opportunity to justify the faith that Colonel Vega had placed in her, and the sacrifice that Santos and her ground crew had made possible. Ghost Rider Magic Eye, multiple SAM launches, you've got company. Ghost saw the missiles rising to meet her, 4 telephone poles of destruction following ballistic arcs designed to intersect her flight path. There was no time for evasion, no opportunity for clever maneuvering. This was the moment that separated real combat pilots from those who simply wore the uniform. She rolled inverted and pulled toward the earth, using gravity to build airspeed while simultaneously releasing chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to confuse the incoming weapons. The A-10 shuddered as she pulled maximum GS, the airframe groaning under stresses that would have torn apart lesser aircraft. The first missile detonated close enough to fill the cockpit with light, its shrapnel cratering the canopy and sending spider web cracks across the armored glass. The second missile lost lock in the chaff cloud and tumbled harmlessly into the valley floor. The third weapon tracked true until the final second, when Ghost's radical maneuvering caused it to lose guidance and detonate in empty air. But the fourth missile found its mark. The explosion lifted the A-10's tail and sent the aircraft tumbling through the sky like a broken toy. Ghost fought for control as warning lights filled the cockpit and the master caution alarm screamed in her headset. The right engine was gone, destroyed by shrapnel, and hydraulic fluid painted the inside of the canopy in crimson streaks. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the aircraft hung suspended between controlled flight and catastrophic crash. Ghost's hands moved with practiced precision across the emergency controls, shutting down the damaged engine and transferring control to backup systems. The A-10 wallowed in the air, its flight characteristics fundamentally changed by the loss of power and hydraulic pressure. But the Warthog was designed for exactly this scenario. Built around the principle that aircraft should be able to survive battle damage and continue fighting, the A-10's designers had created a machine that could absorb punishment that would destroy other planes. Ghost felt the aircraft respond to her controls, wounded but not defeated, ready to complete the mission that had brought them to this valley of death. The target compound lay directly ahead, its defenders thinking they had shot down the attacking aircraft. Ghost saw personnel moving in the open, SAM crews reloading their launchers, command vehicles repositioning for better defensive coverage. They had made the classic mistake of assuming that one hit meant one kill. Ghost lined up her attack run on the single engine, feeling the A-10 vibrate with barely contained violence as she brought the GAU-8 cannon to bear on the primary target. The 30mm Gatling gun was the heart of the aircraft's combat system, designed to destroy enemy tanks with depleted uranium rounds traveling at over 3,000 feet per second. "Time to earn your pay," she whispered to the aircraft as she pressed the trigger. What followed was 7 seconds of controlled destruction that would be analyzed and studied in military academies for decades to come. The GAU-8 cannon fired at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, each projectile capable of penetrating tank armor at ranges exceeding a mile. Ghost walked the stream of destruction across the target compound with surgical precision, her damaged aircraft steady despite the massive recoil from the cannon. Buildings exploded into clouds of concrete dust and flying debris. Vehicle fuel tanks detonated in secondary explosions that sent pillars of flame reaching toward the sky. Command bunkers, hardened against conventional explosives, crumpled under the impact of depleted uranium rounds that punched through reinforced concrete like paper. In less than 10 seconds, Years of enemy preparation were reduced to smoking rubble. But the mission wasn't complete. Ghost still had to get home. The valley erupted in defensive fire as every remaining weapon system targeted her damaged aircraft. Tracer rounds filled the air like deadly fireflies, and more SAM launches painted contrails across the morning sky. Ghost put the A-10 into a climbing turn, using terrain features to break line of sight with enemy gunners while climbing toward the safety of higher altitude. The aircraft responded sluggishly to her inputs, its handling degraded by battle damage and the loss of hydraulic pressure. But it climbed, powered by the single surviving engine and sustained by the sheer, bloody-minded determination that had made the A-10 legendary among ground troops who depended on its support. Magic Eye Ghost Rider, target destroyed, RTB. Ghost Rider Magic Eye, outstanding work. We show you climbing out of the target area. What's your status? Ghost scanned her instruments, cataloging the extent of the damage her aircraft had sustained. The list was extensive: right engine destroyed, primary hydraulic system offline, multiple control surface actuators damaged, navigation equipment partially functional. By any rational assessment, she should have edge.